The thunder of hooves echoed across the vast Wyoming plain as Finn Irvington's stallion raced against the gathering storm. His weathered face bore the marks of 32 years riding the frontier, but nothing had prepared him for what he'd find in the shadows of the Tetons that fateful spring day of 1877. The town of Genoa, Wyoming, lay 3 hours behind him, its handful of wooden structures and dusty streets nothing more than a distant memory as he tracked the stray cattle that had wandered from his modest ranch. His trained eye caught sight of hoof prints veering toward the foothills, and he followed, pulling his duster closer as the wind picked up and scattered the first drops of rain across the tall grass. Finn hadn't meant to venture so far into the rocky terrain, but the darkening sky had him searching for shelter. He guided his horse toward a small outcropping, thinking to wait out the worst of the storm, when he noticed something unusual: a thin wisp of smoke curling from what appeared to be a narrow opening in the hillside. Drawing his Winchester from its leather scabbard, Finn approached cautiously. Hostile encounters weren't uncommon in these parts, whether from desperate outlaws or the occasional tribal warrior far from the reservation. But what he found instead would change the course of his life forever. "Hello," he called, dismounting and moving closer to what he now could see was the entrance to a small cave. "Anyone in there?" The silence that followed was broken only by the increasing patter of rain and the low rumble of distant thunder. Then came a sound small and frightened, like the scurrying of a cornered animal. "I mean no harm," Finn called again, lowering his rifle. "Storm's coming in hard, just looking for shelter." A flash of lightning illuminated the cave entrance, and in that brief moment, he caught sight of her, a woman with wild, tangled hair pressed against the far wall of the shallow cave, her eyes wide with fear. She clutched a small knife in her trembling hand, its blade catching the light. "Stay back," she warned, her voice hoarse as if unused to speaking. "I'll cut you if you come closer." Finn slowly placed his rifle on the ground and raised his hands. "Madam, I'm not here to hurt you. Name's Finn Irvington. I've got a small spread about 10 miles south of here." The woman didn't lower her knife, but her eyes, Finn could now see, they were a striking green, darted from him to the opening of the cave where rain now fell in sheets. "You're welcome to share my fire," she finally said, though the knife remained steady in her grip. "But keep your distance." Finn nodded, grateful to be out of the storm. He moved slowly, retrieving his rifle and setting it carefully against the wall before taking a seat across from her, the small fire between them casting dancing shadows on the rocky walls. Now that he was inside, Finn could see the cave for what it was: a temporary home. A few rough implements fashioned from wood and stone lay scattered about, along with a thin bedroll and a small bundle of what appeared to be personal belongings wrapped in a faded shawl. A collection of wild berries and roots sat on a flat stone, evidence of foraging. "Been living here long?" Finn asked carefully, warming his hands by the fire. "Long enough," she answered, her gaze never leaving him. Her dress was tattered and patched, once fine material now reduced to practicality. Despite the dirt and wear, there was a dignity in her posture that spoke of better days. "You got a name, madam?" The woman hesitated, as if weighing the risk of such a simple disclosure. "Grace," she finally said. "Grace Harlow." "Well, Miss Harlow," Finn said, "seems to me a cave is no place for a lady to be making her home." Grace's laugh was sharp and brittle. "Better a cave than a prison, Mr. Irvington." The way she said it, the cold certainty in her voice, told Finn everything he needed to know. She wasn't here by choice, she was hiding. And given the isolation of this place, she was hiding from someone who would look long and hard to find her. "Folks in town might wonder about a woman living alone in these hills," Finn ventured, "especially with winter coming on." "Let them wonder," Grace said firmly. "I've survived worse than cold." A particularly loud crack of thunder made her flinch, and in that moment of vulnerability, Finn caught sight of a healing bruise along her jawline, partially hidden by her matted hair. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He'd seen enough beaten women during his years in mining camps and cow towns to recognize the signs. "Storm looks to be settling in," he observed, changing the subject. "Mind if I tend to my horse? He's just outside getting soaked." Grace nodded warily, and Finn stepped out into the rain to retrieve his mount. He returned a few minutes later, leading his stallion into the wider part of the cave entrance where the animal could stay dry. "Brought some provisions," Finn said, removing a bundle from his saddlebag. "Jerky, hardtack, and a bit of coffee if you're amenable." The mention of coffee brought the first genuine flicker of interest to Grace's eyes, though she tried to hide it. "I haven't had coffee in months," she admitted. Finn set about brewing a pot over her small fire, the familiar routine bringing a sense of normalcy to the strange situation. As the rich aroma filled the cave, he noticed Grace slowly relax, the knife now resting in her lap rather than gripped in her hand. They shared the simple meal in relative silence, broken only by the storm raging outside. Finn didn't press for information, sensing that trust would be hard-won with this woman. Instead, he spoke softly of neutral things: the weather patterns, the mountains to the west, the herd of elk he'd spotted last week. As night fell and the storm continued, it became clear that Finn wouldn't be returning to his ranch until morning. Grace reluctantly agreed he could stay, insisting he sleep near the entrance while she kept to the deeper recesses of the cave. "I'll be gone at first light," Finn promised, "but I'd like to come back, Miss Harlow, bring you some proper supplies." Grace stared at him, suspicion warring with desperate need in her gaze. "Why would you do that?" Finn considered his words carefully. "Because no one should have to live in fear," he said simply, "and it seems to me you've been doing just that for too long." She didn't respond, but she didn't refuse either. And as Finn settled onto his saddle for a makeshift pillow, he caught her watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read: caution, certainly, but perhaps also the faintest glimmer of hope. When morning came, the storm had passed, leaving behind a washed, clean sky and damp earth that steamed in the rising sun. Finn prepared to leave as promised, but paused before mounting his horse. "I'll return in 3 days," he said. "Bring food, blankets, maybe some soap if you'd like." Grace stood at the entrance of the cave, arms crossed protectively across her chest. "I can't pay you. I'm not asking for payment." Finn adjusted his hat against the morning light, just trying to be neighborly. As he rode away, Finn glanced back once to see Grace still standing there, a solitary figure against the rugged landscape. Something in his chest tightened at the sight, and he knew with absolute certainty that he would keep his word. True to his promise, Finn returned 3 days later with saddlebags full of supplies: flour, salt, coffee, dried beans, and bacon wrapped in oilcloth. He'd added a woolen blanket, a bar of lavender soap, and a small hand mirror that had belonged to his mother. This time, Grace met him outside the cave, her hair attempting to be tamed and her face cleaner than before. She accepted his offerings with cautious gratitude, her fingers lingering on the smooth surface of the mirror as if it were made of gold. "Thank you," she said simply. "Thought you might appreciate something besides your own company," Finn replied, producing a dog-eared book from his coat pocket. "It's just a collection of poetry, nothing fancy, but the words are fine." Grace took the book as if it were a fragile bird, opening it carefully to scan the pages. "I used to read," she said softly. "Before." Finn didn't ask before what. Instead, he said, "I could bring more books, got a small shelf of them at the ranch," and so began a pattern. Every few days, Finn would ride out to the cave, bringing supplies and books. Sometimes he'd stay for a meal, sharing stories of his life, how he'd come west after the war between the states, worked cattle drives through Texas, and eventually saved enough to buy his small ranch near Genoa. He spoke of the town, the people there, careful to keep his tales light and entertaining. Grace rarely spoke of herself, but with each visit, she seemed to thaw a little more. She began to venture outside the cave more often, collecting herbs and plants that she explained had medicinal properties. She showed Finn how to identify edible roots and which berries would cause a stomachache. As summer bloomed across the Wyoming landscape, Grace's appearance gradually changed. Her hair, washed with Finn's soap, revealed itself to be a rich auburn rather than the dull brown he'd first seen. Regular meals had begun to fill out her gaunt frame, and sometimes rarely she would smile at something Finn said, the expression transforming her face into something close to beautiful. It was during his 7th visit that Finn finally broached the subject. they'd been dancing around. "Winter comes early in these mountains," he said as they sat outside the cave, watching the sunset paint the distant peaks in gold and crimson. "This place won't be safe once snow falls." Grace tensed beside him. "I've thought of that." "I've been thinking too," Finn continued carefully. "My ranch has a small cabin about half a mile from the main house. Used to be for hired hands, but I've been working the place alone these past 2 years. It's empty, sturdy, and private." Grace turned to study his face, searching for some hidden meaning behind the offer. "Why would you do that?" "Because I think you deserve better than hiding in a cave," Finn said honestly. "And because I'd rest easier knowing you weren't freezing to death up here." "You don't know me," Grace reminded him. "You don't know what I've done or what's been done to me." "I know enough," Finn replied. "I know you're brave and resourceful. I know you can identify more plants than any doctor I've met. I know you prefer Wordsworth to Whitman, and that you take your coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in it." A ghost of a smile touched Grace's lips at that last observation, but quickly faded. "There's someone looking for me," she admitted, her voice barely audible above the evening breeze. "Someone dangerous," Finn nodded, having suspected as much. "The cabin is well off the main road. No one would know you're there except me, and I'm a light sleeper with a good rifle." Grace looked away back toward the setting sun. "Let me think on it," she said finally. Finn didn't press further. As he prepared to leave, Grace handed him back the book he'd brought on his previous visit, a collection of Shakespeare's sonnets. "Could you?" She hesitated. "Could you bring something with stories next time? Something with adventure, perhaps?" Finn smiled. "I think I can manage that." When he returned a week later, the cave was empty. For a moment, Finn's heart sank, thinking Grace had fled rather than consider his offer. But then he noticed a small piece of paper tucked between two rocks at the entrance. The handwriting was neat and precise. "I accept your offer of shelter. If it still stands, I will meet you at the large oak where the creek bends tomorrow at noon." Relief flooded through him. Finn spent the ride back to his ranch planning the preparations for the cabin. It would need cleaning, repairs to the roof, a fresh supply of firewood. He'd have to bring furniture from town, a proper bed, a table, chairs. His mind raced with all that needed to be done to make the small structure not just habitable, but comfortable. The next day, Finn arrived at the oak tree early, half afraid that Grace would change her mind. But precisely at noon, she appeared from between the trees, carrying her meager belongings wrapped in the shawl he'd first seen in the cave. "You came," he said, unable to keep the relief from his voice. Grace nodded, her expression a complex mixture of fear and determination. "I decided I don't want to die in that cave." "Well, that's a start," Finn said, extending his hand to help her onto his horse. After a moment's hesitation, she took it, settling behind him on the saddle. The ride to Finn's ranch took nearly 2 hours, during which Grace remained silent, her arms loosely wrapped around Finn's waist for balance. He could feel her tension in the rigid way she held herself, and understood that each hoofbeat was taking her further from what had become a strange sort of safety and deeper into the unknown. As they crested a small rise, Finn reined in his horse. Below them stretched a modest valley, green with summer grass. A small creek wound through it like a silver ribbon, and nestled against a stand of cottonwoods sat a weathered but solid 2-story farmhouse with a barn and corral beside it. About a quarter-mile away, partially hidden by a gentle slope, stood a smaller cabin. "That's the main house," Finn explained, pointing. "And over there is the cabin I mentioned. We'll need to fix it up some, but the structure is sound." Grace's eyes moved between the two buildings, calculating the distance. "It's far enough away," she said, more to herself than to Finn. "Far enough for privacy," he agreed, "but close enough if you need anything." They rode down into the valley, the horse picking its way carefully along the slope. As they approached the cabin, Finn could see it through fresh eyes, the weathered boards, the small porch with its missing step, the chimney that needed repointing. It wasn't much, but it had possibilities. "It's not fancy," he said apologetically as they dismounted. Grace walked slowly around the exterior of the cabin, her hand trailing along the rough wood. "It has walls," she said, "and a door that locks. That's fancy enough for me." Finn showed her inside. The cabin consisted of 2 rooms, a main living area with a stone fireplace, and a smaller bedroom at the back. A thick layer of dust covered everything, and a family of mice had clearly made themselves at home in one corner, but the roof appeared intact, and the windows, though grimy, were unbroken. "Needs a woman's touch," Finn admitted, "and a man's elbow grease, but we can have it livable by nightfall and comfortable within a week." Grace stood in the center of the main room, turning slowly to take it all in. Finn couldn't read her expression, whether she was disappointed or relieved or simply overwhelmed. "I can't pay rent," she said finally, echoing her words from their first meeting. "Not asking for any," Finn replied, "but if you're willing, I could use help with the kitchen garden. It's gone to seed since I've been on my own." It was an offer that preserved her dignity while acknowledging her skills, and Grace recognized it as such. She nodded. "I can do that, and perhaps cooking sometimes. I was told I make a decent stew." "That would be more than fair," Finn agreed, pleased by this small opening. "Now, why don't we start by airing this place out? I'll fetch water and tools from the main house." They worked through the afternoon, Finn repairing the porch step and securing loose boards while Grace swept away years of dust and cobwebs. By evening, the cabin smelled of soap and fresh air rather than must and mice. Finn had brought a cot and blankets from the main house, along with a small table, 2 chairs, and basic kitchen implements. "It's not much," he apologized again as they stood back to survey their work, "but it's a start." Grace looked around the space that already felt transformed from the abandoned shell they'd entered hours earlier. "It's more than I've had in a long time," she said softly. Over the next weeks, the cabin continued its transformation. Finn brought lumber from town to build shelves and a proper bed frame. He replaced the cracked window glass and reinforced the door with a new, sturdy lock. Each improvement was met with Grace's quiet appreciation and increasingly her suggestions. "The light would be better if the table were moved beneath the window," she might say, or "a hook here would be useful for hanging the lantern." Small changes that made the space more functional, more comfortable, more hers. For her part, Grace attacked the abandoned kitchen garden with determination, clearing weeds and nurturing the perennial herbs that had managed to survive neglect. She planted late summer vegetables, radishes, lettuce, turnips that would mature quickly before the first frost. The garden became a buffer zone between them, a neutral territory where Grace seemed most at ease. As they worked side by side, she began to share fragments of her past that she'd been born in St. Louis to a merchant family, educated at a ladies' seminary, married at 18 to a man her father's age. She never spoke directly of abuse, but Finn could read between the carefully constructed lines. The way her husband had isolated her from family and friends. How he'd controlled every aspect of her life, from the clothes she wore to the food she ate, the punishments for perceived transgressions that grew more severe with each passing year. "I thought it was normal," she confessed one afternoon as they harvested the first radishes. "I thought all wives lived in such fear." Finn, kneeling in the dirt beside her, wanted nothing more than to reach out and take her hand, but he restrained himself, knowing she wasn't ready for such contact. Instead, he said, "No one deserves to live in fear, Grace, especially not in their own home." She nodded, her eyes fixed on the small red globe she just pulled from the earth. "I came to understand that. Too late, perhaps, but I did understand it." As summer gave way to autumn, Grace ventured into the main house for the first time, initially just to use the kitchen for canning the garden's harvest. But gradually, she began to spend more time there, preparing meals that they would share at the scrubbed wooden table. She moved cautiously through the rooms, as if mapping an unfamiliar and potentially dangerous landscape. Finn never pressed her to talk about the husband she'd fled. But as the weeks passed and trust grew between them, Grace began to fill in the gaps of her story. His name was Victor Harlow, a wealthy businessman from Chicago who had seemed charming and sophisticated during their brief courtship. The violence had begun on their wedding night and escalated over the 4 years of their marriage. "He was careful," Grace explained one evening as they sat before the fire in the main house. The marks were always where clothing would hide them. He had a reputation to protect, after all. Finn's hands tightened around his coffee cup, the only outward sign of his rage at what she'd endured. "How did you get away?" he asked. Grace's gaze was distant, lost in memory. "He went to St. Louis on business. 2 weeks," he said. "I'd been planning for months, hiding away small amounts of money, learning train schedules. I took what I could carry and ran. Changed trains 3 times, always heading west." She paused, her fingers absently tracing the rim of her cup. "I made it as far as Laramie before my money ran out. Took work as a laundress for a few weeks, but then..." She swallowed hard. "I saw a man who knew Victor. He didn't recognize me. I'd cut my hair, was dressed plainly, but I knew it was only a matter of time. So I ran again, on foot this time, until I found the cave." Finn absorbed this information, mentally calculating the danger. "Does your husband have connections in Wyoming?" "Friends in law enforcement. Victor has connections everywhere," Grace said with certainty. "Money buys influence, and he has plenty of both. He's not a man who loses gracefully, especially not something he considers his property." The word property hung in the air between them, ugly and stark. Finn understood then that Grace wasn't simply hiding from abuse, she was hiding from a man who would see her death as preferable to her escape. "This place is remote," Finn said carefully. "Few visitors, and those mostly local ranchers who mind their own business." "But if you'd feel safer elsewhere..." "No," Grace interrupted, surprising him with her vehemence. "No, She hesitated, then continued more softly. "I feel safe here, with you." The simple declaration warmed Finn more than the fire before them. "Then here you'll stay," he said, "for as long as you want." As autumn deepened, bringing frosty mornings and golden afternoons, the cabin continued its transformation. Finn brought bolts of cheerful fabric from town, and Grace fashioned curtains and cushions that added color to the rustic space. A small bookshelf now stood beside the fireplace, gradually filling with volumes from Finn's collection and occasional new purchases from the mercantile in Genoa. But the most significant change was in Grace herself. The haunted look in her eyes began to fade, replaced by a quiet determination and, increasingly, moments of genuine pleasure. She laughed more easily, spoke more freely, and the flinch that had once accompanied any sudden movement or loud noise gradually disappeared. One crisp October afternoon, Finn returned from checking fence lines to find Grace standing in the yard between the 2 houses, a rifle in her hands. She was sighting along the barrel at a row of tin cans arranged on a distant fence post. "Hope you don't mind," she called as he approached. "Found this in the storeroom. Thought I should learn to use it." Finn dismounted, noting the Winchester was his old spare, serviceable but not his primary weapon. "Not at all," he said, coming to stand beside her, "but your stance needs work if you're planning to hit anything smaller than a barn." Grace gave him a look that was part challenge, part amusement. "Show me, then." For the next hour, Finn demonstrated proper shooting technique, how to brace the rifle against her shoulder, how to control her breathing, how to squeeze rather than pull the trigger. Grace was a quick study, her concentration absolute, and by the end of the lesson she was hitting the cans more often than missing. "Not bad for a first try," Finn acknowledged as they walked back toward the house, the rifle now comfortably carried in Grace's arms. "Practice regularly and you'll be outshooting most men in the territory." "Is that what you want?" Grace asked suddenly. "For me to be able to defend myself." Finn considered the question seriously. "What I want," he said finally, "is for you never to need to defend yourself again. But since I can't guarantee that, yes, I want you to have the means to stay safe." Grace nodded, seemingly satisfied with his answer. "I've been dependent on others my whole life," she said. "First my father, then Victor. I don't want to be dependent on you the same way." "There's a difference between dependence and trust," Finn pointed out. "Dependence is being forced to rely on someone who controls you. Trust is choosing to rely on someone who respects you." They had reached the porch of the main house, and Grace paused, looking up at him with an expression he couldn't quite decipher. "I'm learning the difference," she said quietly. As they prepared for winter, a comfortable routine developed. Mornings found them working separately, Finn tending to the small herd of cattle and horses that constituted his livelihood. Grace maintaining the household and preserving the last of the garden's bounty. Afternoons often brought them together for shared tasks, chopping and stacking firewood, repairing fences, smoking meat for the winter stores. Evenings were devoted to quieter pursuits. Grace had revealed herself to be an accomplished pianist, and the small upright piano in Finn's parlor, long silent, now regularly filled the house with music. Finn, in turn, taught Grace the card games he'd learned during his cattle-driving days, careful to leave out the more unsavory lessons from those rough establishments. Sometimes they simply read together before the fire, comfortable in a silence that no longer felt awkward or tense. Finn found himself watching Grace during these moments, noting the way the firelight caught in her hair or how her expression changed as she encountered a particularly moving passage in her book. He was falling in love with her. He realized one evening as she sat at the piano, her fingers moving gracefully over the keys as she played a haunting melody he didn't recognize. The knowledge didn't surprise him. It had been building for months, this quiet affection that had deepened into something more profound. What surprised him was how content he felt to simply admire her from a distance, asking nothing, expecting nothing. Grace deserved time and space to heal, to rediscover herself without the pressure of a man's desires or expectations. Finn was determined to give her that gift, even if it meant burying his own feelings. What he didn't know was that Grace was engaged in her own observations, her own realizations. She noticed the gentleness with which Finn handled even the most stubborn livestock, the respect he showed to the Mexican family that occasionally worked for him during busy seasons, the way he always asked rather than told, suggested rather than demanded. She noticed, too, the breadth of his shoulders as he split logs for the winter woodpile, the grace with which he sat a horse as if man and animal were a single being, the lines at the corners of his eyes that deepened when he smiled, which was often. Grace had never known a man like Finn Irvington, a man who offered safety without suffocation, kindness without debt, strength without threat. It confused her, this freedom he gave her, and sometimes she found herself testing its boundaries, waiting for the moment when his patience would snap and the true demands would emerge. But they never did. The first snow came in early November, dusting the valley in white that glittered in the morning sun. Grace stood on the porch of the cabin, wrapped in a woolen shawl Finn had brought from town, and watched as he made his way through the snow toward her, a basket in his hands. "Thought you might want fresh eggs for breakfast," he called, his breath fogging in the cold air. "Chickens are laying well despite the weather." Grace accepted the basket, noticing that he'd included a jar of honey and a small package wrapped in brown paper. "What's this?" "Just something I picked up last time I was in town," Finn said, suddenly looking boyishly uncertain. "Go ahead, open it." Inside the package was a collection of Tennyson's poems, bound in soft leather with gold-edged pages. It was clearly new and of fine quality, nothing like the dog-eared volumes they usually shared. "It's beautiful," Grace breathed, running her fingers over the smooth cover. "But Finn, this must have cost nothing compared to the pleasure it will bring," he interrupted gently. "Besides, winter's long in these parts. We'll need good reading to see us through." Grace looked up from the book to study his face, snow catching in his dark hair and beard. "Thank you," she said, meaning far more than the gift. Finn seemed to understand, his smile warming his eyes. "You're welcome." That evening, they sat before the fire in the main house, taking turns reading aloud from the new volume. Outside, the snow fell steadily, insulating the world in white silence. Inside, the fire crackled and spat, casting golden light over the simple furnishings and the two people who had, against all odds, found comfort in each other's company. As Grace read Ulysses with its stirring declaration to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield, Finn watched the play of emotions across her face, the determination in her voice as she spoke words that seemed to resonate with her own journey. When she finished, a comfortable silence fell between them. "I never thought I'd feel safe again," Grace said suddenly, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames. "After I left Victor, I thought I'd spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, waiting for him to find me." Finn remained quiet, sensing she had more to say. I still worry, she continued. I still have nightmares sometimes, but here in this house, in that cabin. She looked up, meeting his eyes directly. You've built me more than shelter, Finn. You've built me a place where fear can't follow. The simple truth of her words caught him off guard, and for a moment, Finn couldn't speak past the tightness in his throat. That's all I wanted, he finally managed, for you to feel safe. Grace set the book aside and, in a gesture that seemed both deliberate and spontaneous, reached across the space between them to take his hand. It was the first time she had initiated physical contact between them, and the significance wasn't lost on either of them. I do, she said softly. Safe enough to start thinking about the future, not just running from the past. Finn's heart quickened at her words and the warm pressure of her hand in his. And what does that future look like? He asked carefully. Grace's smile was small but genuine. I'm not entirely sure yet, but I think I'd like to find out, here. It was a beginning tentative, fragile but real. As the snow continued to fall outside, wrapping the ranch in pristine white, they sat hand in hand before the fire, two people who had found in each other something neither had been looking for, but both had needed. The winter of 1877 proved to be one of the harshest in memory, with snow piling high around the buildings and temperatures dropping so low that the creek froze solid. But within the walls of both house and cabin, warmth prevailed. Grace continued to live in the cabin, valuing her independence even as she and Finn grew closer. They developed signals. A lantern in the window meant an invitation to dinner. A particular sequence of knocks indicated urgency. These small communications formed a language between them, built on respect for boundaries and growing affection. For Christmas, Finn surprised Grace with a sewing machine ordered from a catalog months earlier. She, in turn, presented him with a hand-knitted scarf, an edition of Mark Twain's latest work that she'd secretly arranged for the general store owner to include in Finn's monthly supply order. New Year's Eve found them sitting on the porch of the main house despite the cold, bundled in blankets and watching the stars that seemed close enough to touch in the crystal-clear air. Any resolutions for the new year? Finn asked, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Grace considered the question seriously. To stop looking backward, she said finally, and to trust what's in front of me. Finn nodded, understanding the significance of such a resolution for someone whose trust had been so thoroughly betrayed. Good one, he said. Mine's simpler, to build something lasting. Your ranch? Grace asked. Finn smiled into the darkness. That too. As they sat in comfortable silence, a shooting star streaked across the heavens, its brief, brilliant passage causing them both to catch their breath. Grace, acting on impulse, leaned over and pressed a gentle kiss to Finn's cheek. For luck in the new year, she explained, a blush coloring her cheeks that had nothing to do with the cold. Finn's heart raced at the simple gesture, but he kept his reaction measured, recognizing the courage it had taken for her to initiate even this modest intimacy. I already feel pretty lucky, he said softly. January brought blizzards that isolated the ranch for weeks at a time, forcing them into even closer proximity. They passed the days with indoor tasks, mending harnesses, darning socks, reading aloud by lamplight. Grace taught Finn to play chess, a game her father had loved, and Finn showed Grace how to carve simple figures from wood, a skill he'd picked up during long winter evenings on the trail. It was during one such storm, with wind howling around the eaves and snow piling against the windows, that Grace finally told Finn the full story of her escape. They were sitting at the kitchen table, a chess game abandoned between them, when she began speaking in a quiet, measured voice. I think I would have died if I'd stayed, she said, her fingers absently tracing the edge of a chess piece. The last time before I left, Victor broke 2 of my ribs. I couldn't breathe without pain for weeks. Finn's hand tightened around his coffee cup, but he remained silent, letting her speak at her own pace. He had a business trip planned to St. Louis, something he couldn't postpone. Before he left, he locked me in our bedroom, told the servants I was ill and not to be disturbed. Grace's voice remained steady, though her eyes had taken on a distant look. He'd done it before, but usually only for a day or two. This time would be 2 weeks. She took a deep breath. I had a hairpin I'd managed to hide, used it to pick the lock once the house was quiet. I'd been saving money for months, small amounts he wouldn't notice, a few dollars at a time from the household accounts. It wasn't much, but enough for train fare. Grace described her journey west, the constant fear of discovery, changing trains repeatedly, adopting different names in each new town. How she'd worked briefly in Laramie, sleeping in a boarding house for working women until the day she spotted one of Victor's business associates on the street. I panicked, she admitted. Grabbed what I could carry and just ran, walked for days, keeping off the main roads. When I found that cave, it seemed like Providence, hidden, defensible with water nearby. I thought I'd stay just until I could plan my next move, but days turned to weeks, and then I showed up, Finn finished for her. Grace nodded, finally looking up to meet his eyes. At first I thought you might be working for him. Victor has connections, resources. He's not a man who lets go of what he considers his. I'm not working for anyone but myself, Finn assured her. I know that now. Grace's smile was sad but genuine. It took time to believe it, though. To believe that someone could help without wanting. Payment. The word hung between them, heavy with implication. Finn understood then that her wariness had been about more than just the trauma of abuse. It had been about expecting a different kind of transaction, a different kind of ownership. Grace, he said carefully, I need you to know something. What I've given the cabin, the supplies, my time, none of it comes with obligations. Not now, not ever. I've come to understand that, she said softly. It's what makes you different from every other man I've known. The storm continued through the night, but something had shifted between them. A final barrier had been breached, not through force but through its absence, through Finn's consistent demonstration that power didn't have to corrupt, that strength could protect rather than harm. As February gave way to March and the first signs of thaw appeared in the valley, Grace began to venture more frequently into town. At first, she accompanied Finn on his monthly supply runs, staying close to his side as they navigated the dusty streets of Genoa. But gradually, she gained confidence, even making occasional trips on her own with the light wagon Finn taught her to drive. The townsfolk, initially curious about the solitary woman from Finn's ranch, quickly accepted her presence. Grace cultivated a quiet friendship with the wife of the general store owner, a kindly woman named Sarah who shared her love of books and music. Through this connection, Grace began to receive invitations to small gatherings, quilting circles, church socials, impromptu musical evenings. Finn encouraged these outings, recognizing Grace's need to rebuild a sense of community and identity separate from both her past and her relationship with him. He watched with pride as she gradually blossomed in these new interactions, her natural intelligence and gentle wit earning her the respect of the town's women. It was after one such gathering in late March that Grace returned to the ranch with an unusual tension in her posture. Finn, who had come to read her moods with increasing accuracy, noticed immediately as she unhitched the wagon with movements that were too careful, too controlled. "Everything all right?" he asked as he helped her lead the horse to its stall. Grace nodded, but her eyes didn't meet his. "Just tired." It was a lovely afternoon, but Mrs. Peterson's youngest has a set of lungs on him that could wake the dead. Finn accepted the explanation, even though he sensed there was more to her disquiet. He'd learned that pushing Grace rarely yielded results. She would share her concerns in her own time if they were important. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of purple and gold, Grace finally spoke what was on her mind. "There was a stranger in town today," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "A man asking questions at the hotel." Finn felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. What kind of questions? About newcomers to the area, women in particular. Grace's hands were folded tightly in her lap. Sarah overheard him speaking with Mr. Jenkins at the hotel. He described a woman with auburn hair and green eyes, educated, possibly using a different name. Finn absorbed this information, considering its implications. "Did anyone make the connection to you?" "I don't think so. I've been careful not to share much about my past, and my appearance has changed considerably since." She gestured vaguely, indicating the healthy weight she'd gained, the sun-kissed quality of her once pale skin, the confidence in her posture that had replaced fearful hunching. "Still," Finn said thoughtfully, "might be best if you stay close to home for a while, at least until we know who this stranger is and what he wants." Grace nodded, relieved at his calm reaction. "I thought the same. I've made enough purchases to last a few weeks, and the garden will need attention soon anyway." They sat in silence for a moment, watching as the first stars appeared in the deepening blue of the evening sky. "Finn," Grace said finally, her voice small but determined, "if he finds me, if Victor somehow tracks me here, I want you to know that I won't go back. Not alive." The quiet certainty in her voice sent a chill through Finn that had nothing to do with the evening air. "It won't come to that," he said firmly, "but if trouble does come looking, it'll find more than it bargained for." The stranger remained in Genoa for 3 days, asking questions at the hotel, the saloon, and the general store. Finn, making a brief trip to town for mail, observed him from a distance, a well-dressed man in his 40s with the soft hands and hard eyes of someone used to giving orders, rather than taking them. Whether he was Victor himself or merely an agent, the message was clear. Grace was still being hunted, even after nearly a year. Finn took precautions. He moved Grace temporarily into the main house, where the thick walls and defensible position offered better protection than the isolated cabin. He kept his rifle loaded and within reach, taught Grace to use the shotgun as well as the Winchester, and established a signal with his nearest neighbor. 3 shots fired in rapid succession meant send help. For 2 weeks, they lived in this state of heightened vigilance, jumping at unexpected sounds and scanning the horizon for approaching riders. But no one came to the ranch, and eventually word reached them through Sarah that the stranger had departed on the eastbound stage, apparently empty-handed. "Do you think it's over?" Grace asked one evening as they sat on the porch, the lengthening spring days allowing them to enjoy the sunset without the bitter cold of winter. Finn considered the question honestly. "For now, perhaps. But if it was your husband or someone working for him, I doubt he'll give up so easily." Grace nodded, having expected this answer. "Then we should prepare for his return." "We will," Finn promised, "but in the meantime we can't stop living our lives." Fear of what might happen can be as crippling as the thing itself. Grace smiled at that, recognizing her own words from months earlier echoed back to her. "You're right, of course, and I refuse to go back to living in a cave, literal or figurative." As spring bloomed across the valley, bringing wildflowers and new calves to the ranch, Grace made a decision. One sunny morning, she rode into town alone, her head held high despite the lingering anxiety that accompanied her beyond the safe boundaries of Finn's property. Her destination was the small law office at the end of the town's main street. The lawyer, a young man named Ellis who had recently established his practice in Genoa, welcomed her with professional courtesy. "What can I do for you, Miss Harlow?" he asked, gesturing for her to take a seat. Grace sat, her back straight and her resolve firm. "I need to know my legal position, Mr. Ellis. I left my husband in Chicago last year, left him but did not divorce him." The lawyer's expression remained neutral, though his eyes sharpened with interest. "I see. And you're considering divorce proceedings now?" "I need to know if it's possible," Grace said. "If I can file here in Wyoming territory without returning to Illinois, and what rights he would have if he were to find me." Ellis considered her carefully. He was young but not naive, and the Western territories had taught him to recognize the signs of a woman who had fled abuse. "The law is complex in these matters," he said, "but Wyoming territory has some of the most progressive divorce statutes in the nation. Cruelty is grounds for dissolution, as is abandonment." "He didn't abandon me," Grace pointed out. "I left him." "After how long a marriage?" Ellis asked. 4 years, the lawyer nodded. "And during those years, did he provide proper support?" "Not just financial, but the care and consideration a husband owes a wife." Grace's laugh held no humor. "No, Mr. Ellis, he did not." "Then a case could be made for constructive abandonment, that he abandoned his marital duties while you physically remained." Ellis leaned forward, his manner becoming more confidential. "Miss Harlow, I won't ask for details you're not comfortable sharing, but I should tell you that injuries inflicted by a spouse would constitute extreme cruelty under territorial law." Grace absorbed this information, hope and fear warring within her. And if I were to file for divorce, would he be notified? Would he learn where I am? Not necessarily, Ellis assured her. Publication notices can be somewhat vague as to location. And given certain circumstances, fear for personal safety, for instance, a judge might allow even greater discretion. For the next hour, they discussed the legal pathways available to her. By the time Grace left the office, she had a clearer understanding of both the possibilities and the risks involved in seeking legal freedom from Victor. She rode back to the ranch with a mixture of emotions: determination, anxiety, and a fragile hope that perhaps a future entirely her own was within reach. Finn was mending a fence near the main house when she returned, and he straightened as she approached, noting the thoughtful expression on her face. "Everything all right in town?" he asked. Grace dismounted, leading her horse toward the barn. "Yes," she said. "I had a meeting with Mr. Ellis, the lawyer." Finn raised an eyebrow but didn't press for details as he fell into step beside her. "Seems like a decent sort from what I've heard, new to the area but fair-minded." "He is," Grace agreed. As they reached the barn and began unsaddling the horse, she continued, "I asked him about divorce, about whether I could file here without returning to Chicago." Finn's hands stilled on the saddle buckle, but his voice remained casual. "And can you, potentially?" "There would be complications, of course, but Mr. Ellis believes it's possible, especially given—" She hesitated. "Given the circumstances of my marriage," Finn nodded, understanding what she couldn't quite bring herself to say explicitly. "Sounds like a step worth considering if it's what you want." Grace led the horse into its stall before turning to face him directly. "It is what I want, to be truly free, not just hidden. To build a life without looking over my shoulder, without being legally bound to a man who treated me as property." "Then I support you," Finn said simply. "Whatever you need: funds for legal fees, transportation to the county seat, testimony if it comes to that, it's yours." Grace studied his face in the dim light of the barn. "You understand what this could mean, if Victor contests the divorce, if he learns where I am." "I understand the risks," Finn said firmly. "I also understand that living half a life always in fear isn't really living at all." Grace's eyes filled with unexpected tears at his words. "That's what I've been thinking. That despite everything, the cabin, the garden, even our friendship, I'm still letting him control me as long as I'm legally his wife." Finn wanted to reach for her, to offer physical comfort, but maintained the respectful distance that had become their habit. "You deserve to be your own woman, Grace, free to make your own choices." A soft smile curved her lips as she closed the distance between them, placing her hand gently on his arm. "Thank you for understanding, for not trying to replace one form of ownership with another." The touch of her hand, warm and deliberate, sent a current through Finn that he struggled to contain. "I never wanted to own you, Grace, just to see you whole and happy." "I know," she said softly. "That's why." She didn't finish the sentence, but her meaning hung in the air between them. Instead, she rose on tiptoe and pressed a gentle kiss to his cheek, much as she had on New Year's Eve, before turning to lead the way out of the barn. Finn remained motionless for a moment, his hand rising to touch the spot where her lips had brushed his skin. Something had shifted between them today, some invisible barrier breaking down not with force, but with the gentle persistence of trust. Outside, the spring sunshine bathed the ranch in golden light, and as Finn followed Grace toward the house, he found himself truly hoping for the first time that the future might hold more than friendship between them. The legal process moved slowly. Throughout April and May, Grace made regular trips to the lawyer's office, providing details of her marriage and separation that could be incorporated into the divorce petition without revealing her exact location. Mr. Ellis, recognizing the seriousness of her situation, took special precautions, filing paperwork in the county seat rather than Genoa, using only her married name in the documents, and arranging for publication notices to appear in newspapers far from Wyoming territory. The waiting was difficult. Each day brought the possibility of news either that the divorce had been granted by default if Victor failed to respond, or that he had contested it and possibly learned her whereabouts. Grace channeled her anxiety into work. She expanded the kitchen garden into a proper vegetable plot, started a small flock of chickens, and even began helping Finn with the cattle, learning to ride astride rather than side saddle. Wearing split skirts, she sewed herself from sturdy denim. Finn, for his part, began construction on an addition to the cabin, a glassed-in sunroom where Grace could grow herbs and flowers during the harsh Wyoming winters. It was a gesture of faith in the future, a statement that regardless of legal outcomes, her place on the ranch was permanent if she wanted it to be. They didn't speak directly of what might be growing between them, but small changes in their interactions told the story. Grace's hand lingering on Finn's when he helped her dismount after a day's riding. Finn's eyes following her movements as she worked in the garden, no longer trying to hide his admiration. Evenings on the porch that stretched later and later, neither wanting to break the spell of their companionship. In early June, a letter arrived from Mr. Ellis. Grace's hands trembled as she opened it, Finn standing beside her with quiet support. Inside was a brief note and a legal document. "It is my pleasure to inform you that the Circuit Court has granted your petition for divorce," the letter read. The enclosed decree, signed by Judge Harkins, legally dissolves your marriage to Victor Harlow on grounds of extreme cruelty. As we discussed, this ruling was made by default after your husband failed to respond to published notices within the statutory period. You are now, in the eyes of the law, a free woman. Grace read the words twice, then again, before looking up at Finn with eyes bright with unshed tears. "It's done," she whispered. "I'm free." Finn's smile was gentle but radiant. "Congratulations, Grace, you earned this." That evening, they celebrated with a special dinner at the main house. Venison Finn had hunted, vegetables from Grace's garden, and a bottle of good whiskey he'd been saving for a worthy occasion. As night fell and they sat together on the porch, the whiskey warming their blood and loosening the careful restraint they'd maintained for nearly a year, Grace turned to Finn with newfound confidence. "I've been thinking about my name," she said. "I don't want to be a Harlow anymore, but I'm not sure about returning to my maiden name either. That feels like going backwards somehow." Finn nodded, understanding her dilemma. "You could choose something entirely new, a name that means something to you." Grace considered this, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass. "I could," she agreed. "Or," she hesitated, then continued with quiet determination, "or I could take a different name altogether. Yours, perhaps." The simple statement hung in the air between them, its implications unmistakable. Finn set his glass down carefully, making sure his voice was steady when he spoke. "Grace, are you saying what I think you're saying?" She met his gaze directly, the firelight from the nearby lamp highlighting the gold flecks in her green eyes. "I'm saying that I love you, Finn Irvington. I love the man who found me at my lowest point and never once made me feel lesser for it. Who built me not just shelter but a home where fear couldn't follow. Who taught me that strength can protect rather than harm." Finn felt his heart racing, hardly daring to believe what he was hearing. "Grace, please let me finish," she interrupted gently. "I know this might seem sudden, but it isn't, not really. I've loved you for months now, but I needed to be free, truly free, before I could offer you my heart. I needed to come to you not as someone seeking rescue, but as a woman making a choice." Finn reached across the space between them, taking her hand in his. "I've loved you since that day by the garden, when you told me the names of all those plants I'd been calling weeds. Loved your strength, your kindness, your determination to rebuild what was broken." He squeezed her fingers gently. "But I would have waited forever if needed, until you were ready." Grace's smile was luminous in the gathering dusk. "I'm ready now, to start a new life with a new name. If you'll have me." In answer, Finn rose from his chair and knelt before her, still holding her hand. There were no rings, no rehearsed speeches, just the honest words of a man who had found his heart's match in the most unexpected of places. "Grace, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Not because you need my protection or my name, but because we've found something worth building together." Grace's free hand came up to touch his face, fingers tracing the line of his beard with wonder. "Yes," she whispered. Yes, I will. Finn stood, drawing her up with him. With infinite gentleness, he framed her face with his hands and lowered his mouth to hers in their first kiss, tentative at first, then deepening as Grace responded with unexpected passion, her arms sliding around his neck to pull him closer. When they finally separated, both breathing unsteadily, Finn rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that for a very long time," he admitted. Grace laughed softly, her eyes dancing with joy. "What took you so long, Cowboy?" They were married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the small church in Genoa. Grace wore a dress of pale blue silk that Sarah from the general store had helped her make, with wildflowers from the valley woven into her hair. Finn, in the best suit he owned, watched her walk toward him with an expression of such undisguised adoration that several of the town's women dabbed at their eyes. The celebration afterward was held at the ranch, with tables set up in the yard between the main house and the cabin. Neighbors and townsfolk who had come to respect both Finn and Grace brought food and drink, music and laughter. As the summer sun began to set, casting long golden shadows across the valley, the newlyweds opened the dancing, moving together with a natural harmony that spoke of the deep understanding between them. "Mrs. Irvington," Finn murmured as they swayed to the music of a fiddle and harmonica. "How does it sound?" Grace's smile was radiant. "Like freedom," she answered. "Like home." Later that night, after the guests had departed and they were finally alone, Finn carried Grace across the threshold of the main house with playful formality. But as he set her down in the parlor, his expression grew serious. "I want you to know something," he said, taking her hands in his. "This marriage doesn't change who owns what on this ranch. Everything I have is yours now in equal measure. The house, the land, the livestock, it's all in both our names." Grace looked up at him with surprise. "Finn, that's not necessary. The law can go hang," he interrupted gently. "I've seen too many widows left with nothing because everything was in their husband's name. That won't happen here. I've already had Mr. Ellis draw up the papers. This is your home, Grace, in every sense of the word." Tears welled in Grace's eyes at this final, profound demonstration of his respect for her independence. "I don't know what I did to deserve you," she whispered. Finn's hands came up to cradle her face. "You survived," he said simply. "You had the courage to flee when staying meant death, the strength to endure loneliness and fear rather than accept cruelty, the wisdom to recognize kindness when it was offered without strings." His thumbs brushed away her tears. "You don't owe me for loving you, Grace. Loving you is the greatest privilege of my life." In the months that followed, Grace and Finn settled into the rhythms of married life with a joy that seemed to infuse every aspect of the ranch. The cabin that had been Grace's sanctuary became a guest house for visiting friends, while the main house transformed under her careful attention from a bachelor's functional quarters to a true home filled with music, books, and the delicious aromas of home-cooked meals. Together, they expanded the ranch operations. Grace's organizational skills and head for figures complemented Finn's practical knowledge of the land and livestock. They hired 2 permanent hands to help with the growing herd, built a larger barn, and added a proper greenhouse where Grace could pursue her interest in medicinal plants year-round. In the evenings, they would often sit on the porch, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in gold and crimson. Sometimes they talked of the future dreams of expanding the ranch, perhaps starting a family. Other times, they simply enjoyed the comfortable silence of 2 people who no longer needed words to communicate their deepest feelings. It was during one such evening in early spring of 1879, as the first anniversary of their marriage approached, that Grace shared news that would once again transform their lives. "Finn," she said, her hand finding his in the gathering dusk, "I visited Dr. Matthews in town today." Finn turned to her with immediate concern. "Are you ill? You've seemed tired lately, but I thought it was just the spring planting." Grace's smile was serene, almost secretive. "Not ill, no, but there is a reason for the fatigue." She guided his hand to rest on her still flat stomach. "We're going to have a baby come autumn." Finn stared at her in wonder, his hand spreading protectively over the place where their child grew. A baby, he repeated, his voice thick with emotion. Our baby, Grace confirmed, her eyes shining with joy. The doctor says everything looks healthy. I'm about 3 months along. Finn pulled her gently into his arms, pressing his face into her hair to hide the tears that had sprung to his eyes. I love you, he whispered. Both of you. Grace held him close, marveling at the journey that had brought her from a cave in the wilderness to this moment of perfect happiness. We love you too, she murmured. As the stars began to appear in the deepening blue of the evening sky, they remained entwined, contemplating the future they would build together. A future in which their child would grow up knowing only safety and love, where fear could not enter. The following months saw the ranch alive with preparations for the baby's arrival. Finn converted one of the upstairs bedrooms into a nursery, crafting a cradle from polished pine and a rocking chair that Grace declared the most comfortable seat in the house. Grace sewed tiny garments from soft flannel and quilted a blanket embroidered with wildflowers like those that had adorned her wedding day. The town of Genoa embraced the news with enthusiasm. The women organized a baby shower, presenting Grace with handmade gifts and sage advice drawn from generations of frontier motherhood. Sarah from the general store promised to stock special items for the baby and even doctor. Matthews, normally reserved, expressed his pleasure at seeing the young couple's happiness. As summer gave way to autumn and Grace's time grew near, Finn found himself experiencing a new kind of anxiety. Having nearly lost his own mother in childbirth, he was acutely aware of the dangers women faced in bringing new life into the world. He insisted on having Dr. Matthews visit the ranch regularly during the final weeks and arranged for Sarah to stay with them when Grace's time came, her experience with 6 children of her own making her an invaluable support. On a crisp October morning, as the aspen trees flamed gold against the blue Wyoming sky, Grace's labor began. Finn, banished to the porch by Sarah's firm command, paced restlessly for hours, wincing at each muffled cry from the upstairs bedroom. Doctor. Matthews arrived mid-morning, his presence both reassuring and terrifying, necessary only if complications arose. The day stretched into evening, and still Finn waited, his prayers becoming increasingly desperate as the hours passed. When he heard the high, indignant wail of a newborn shortly after sunset, his knees nearly buckled with relief. It was Sarah who finally came to the door, her lined face weary but wreathed in smiles. Come meet your son, Mr. Irvington, she said. Both he and his mama are doing just fine. Finn took the stairs 2 at a time, his heart hammering. In the bedroom lit by the warm glow of oil lamps, he found Grace propped against pillows, her face exhausted but radiant, a small bundle cradled in her arms. Finn, she whispered as he approached, come see what we made. He sat carefully on the edge of the bed, hardly daring to breathe as Grace tilted the bundle to reveal a tiny face red and wrinkled, with a shock of dark hair and tightly closed eyes. He has your coloring, Grace said with a tired smile, and your stubborn chin. Finn reached out a tentative finger to touch the baby's cheek, marveling at the impossibly soft skin. He's perfect, he managed, his voice rough with emotion, just like his mother. Would you like to hold your son? Dr. Matthews asked from where he stood gathering his instruments. Finn nodded, suddenly nervous as Grace carefully transferred the swaddled infant into his arms. The baby weighed almost nothing, yet Finn felt the weight of this new responsibility settle on his shoulders like a physical thing, awesome and terrifying and wonderful all at once. Hello, little one, he murmured, cradling his son close to his chest. Welcome to the world. The baby's eyes fluttered open at the sound of his voice, revealing irises of deep blue that would later change to match Finn's own brown. For a moment, father and son regarded each other solemnly, an instant recognition passing between them that transcended words. What shall we call him? Grace asked softly. Finn looked up from his son's face to the woman who had brought this miracle into his life. I thought perhaps William, he suggested, after your father. Tears welled in Grace's eyes at the gesture. She had spoken of her father often over the past year, of his kindness, his love of books, his gentle guidance that had shaped her early years before an untimely death left her vulnerable to Victor's manipulations. "William Finn Irvington," she said, testing the name. "It's perfect." As the doctor and Sarah discreetly left the new family to their private joy, Finn carefully returned the baby to Grace's arms before stretching out on the bed beside them, one arm protectively encircling them both. "Thank you," he whispered, pressing a kiss to Grace's temple. "For him, for us." "For everything." Grace leaned into his embrace, their son nestled between them. "No," she said softly. "Thank you for finding me in that cave, for showing me what love really means." Outside their window, the first stars of evening appeared in the darkening sky, witnessing a tableau as old as humanity itself, a family bound together by love, facing the future with hope and confidence. William, or Will as he quickly became known, thrived under the devoted care of his parents. By his first birthday, he was walking unsteadily around the ranch house, his chubby hands reaching for everything in sight and his infectious laughter filling the rooms that had once known only silence. The ranch prospered as well. Finn and Grace's careful management had increased their cattle herd significantly, and their reputation for fair dealing and quality stock spread throughout the territory. They added 2 more permanent hands to help with the expanded operation and built a bunkhouse near the barn to accommodate them. Grace's greenhouse became something of a local wonder, producing herbs and vegetables even during the harsh Wyoming winters. She began creating salves and tinctures from her plants, drawing on knowledge gleaned from books and from the elderly Shoshone woman who occasionally visited the ranch. These remedies gained a reputation of their own, and people from as far as Laramie sometimes came seeking her help for ailments that conventional medicine couldn't touch. Finn expanded the cabin that had been Grace's first home on the ranch, adding a proper kitchen and second bedroom, transforming it into a guest house where visitors could stay in comfort. Sarah from the general store was their first guest, spending a week with them during the summer when her own house was being repaired after a chimney fire. Life settled into a rhythm marked by the seasons of the land and the milestones of their growing child. Will's first words, "Mama" and "horse," in that order. His first ride on his father's shoulders, his first attempts to help Grace in the garden, each moment preserved in memory and occasional photographs taken when the traveling photographer visited Genoa. In the spring of 1882, when Will was 2.5 years old, Grace shared news of another pregnancy. This time, the announcement was made with confident joy rather than anxious wonder. The entire ranch celebrated, with even the taciturn ranch hands offering shy congratulations. The second pregnancy proved easier than the first, with Grace maintaining her energy and health throughout. On a snowy December morning, after a labor half as long as Will's had been, she gave birth to a daughter, a delicate beauty with her mother's green eyes and a dusting of auburn hair that promised to match Grace's own rich color. "Eleanor," Finn suggested as he held his daughter for the first time, recalling the name Grace had once mentioned as belonging to a beloved grandmother. "Eleanor Sarah Irvington," Grace agreed, watching with tender amusement as Will, supervised closely by one of the ranch hands' wives, carefully climbed onto the bed to peer at his new sister. "Baby small," Will observed with the gravity of a much older child. "I protect." Grace and Finn exchanged glances over their children's heads, both recognizing in their son's simple declaration the essence of what they'd built together, a family bound by love and the determination to keep each other safe. As the years passed, the Irvington Ranch became known throughout the region not just for its fine cattle and Grace's medicinal herbs, but as a place of warmth and welcome. The main house, expanded to accommodate the growing family and frequent guests, stood as a beacon of civilization in the still wild territory, its windows glowing with lamplight on winter evenings, its porch filled with laughter during summer gatherings. Will grew into a thoughtful, responsible boy who combined his father's quiet strength with his mother's quick intelligence. By 10, he was a capable horseman and a voracious reader, equally at home helping with the spring branding or curled up with one of the many books that filled the shelves Finn had built along every available wall. Eleanor, or Ellie, as she was universally known, developed into a spirited child with her mother's grace and a determination entirely her own. Where Will was contemplative, Ellie was action, racing across the ranch on her pony, climbing trees that made even Finn nervous, yet also displaying a surprising gentleness with injured animals and younger children. Through it all, Finn and Grace's partnership deepened, their love for each other evolving from the cautious affection of their early days to a profound understanding that needed no words. They still faced challenges, harsh winters that threatened the herd, occasional conflicts with neighboring ranchers over water rights, the normal friction of two strong-willed people sharing a life and raising children together. But these challenges were met with a united front and the certainty that whatever came, they would face it together. In the spring of 1887, 10 years after Finn had first found Grace in that cave, they stood together on the porch of the main house, watching as Will helped Ellie mount her pony for an afternoon ride around the ranch. At 12 and 5, their children embodied everything they'd hoped to create: a family where fear could not enter, where strength was used to protect rather than harm, where love was the foundation of every interaction. Did you ever imagine this? Grace asked softly, leaning into Finn's side as his arm circled her waist. That day when you found me, did you ever think we'd be standing here like this? Finn considered the question, his gaze taking in the prosperous ranch, the children laughing as they rode toward the creek, the peaceful security of the home they'd built together. I couldn't have imagined it exactly, he admitted. But I knew from that first day that you were someone worth protecting, worth waiting for. He pressed a kiss to her temple, still auburn though now threaded with occasional strands of silver. Worth loving. Grace turned in his embrace, her green eyes as bright and clear as they had been when she'd first looked up at him across a small fire in a cave, knife in hand and fear in her heart. I think a part of me knew too, she said. Even through the fear, something in me recognized something in you, that you were different from any man I'd known before, that with you I could be safe, be myself. Finn's hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb tracing the smile lines that had gradually replaced the worried creases of her earlier years. You saved yourself, Grace. I just provided a bit of shelter along the way. You provided much more than shelter, Grace corrected gently. You built me a home where fear couldn't enter, where love could grow. She rose on tiptoe to press a kiss to his lips, still thrilling at the freedom to express her affection openly without fear of reprisal, and for that I will be grateful every day of my life. As the sun began its descent toward the distant mountains, painting the valley in gold and amber, Finn and Grace remained on the porch, arms entwined, watching their children ride back toward the house. The sound of Will and Ellie's laughter carried on the spring breeze, mingling with the lowing of cattle and the gentle rustle of cottonwood, leaves the soundtrack of the life they'd built together from the most unlikely of beginnings. In the gathering dusk, Finn looked down at the woman who had transformed his solitary existence into a life rich with purpose and joy. I love you, Grace Irvington, he said simply. Yesterday, today, and all our tomorrows. Grace's smile, no longer shadowed by fear or doubt, was radiant in the fading light. And I love you, Finn Irvington, for finding me, for waiting for me, for building this life with me. She gestured toward their approaching children, toward the ranch that had flourished under their joint care. For giving me not just shelter, but a true home. Together, they turned to welcome their children home as the first stars appeared in the evening sky, bearing witness to the enduring power of courage, compassion, and love to heal even the deepest wounds and build something beautiful from broken pieces.